I remember the exact moment everything shifted, though at the time it felt small, almost forgettable, like a glass slipping slightly on the edge of a table but not quite falling. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet in that heavy way our house sometimes held onto silence, as if the walls themselves were listening. My sister Layla stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching me like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't want the answer to. "You've been acting strange," she said, her voice too calm to be casual. I laughed it off, or at least I tried to. "Strange how?" I asked, keeping my back turned as I rinsed the same plate twice, buying time. She didn't respond immediately, and that pause said more than anything she could have said out loud. "Like you know something I don't," she finally replied. That was the moment the glass tipped. Because she was right. I did know something. Something that didn't belong to me. Something that had been sitting in my chest for weeks, growing heavier by the day, pressing against my ribs like it wanted out. And the worst part wasn't the secret itself. It was who it was about. Layla and I had always been close, the kind of close people envied without really understanding. We weren't just sisters, we were mirrors of each other in ways that made the world feel manageable. When our mother passed, it was just the two of us in that house, figuring out how to exist without the one person who had always held everything together. We learned quickly how to lean on each other, how to fill in the gaps. I cooked when she couldn't. She handled the bills when I felt overwhelmed. We didn't need to say things out loud. We just knew. That's why the secret felt like a betrayal long before anything actually broke. It started with a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. I had come home earlier than expected that evening, the sun still hanging low, casting long shadows across the hallway. Layla was in her room, door half closed, speaking in a tone I had never heard before, soft, urgent, almost pleading. I wasn't trying to listen, not at first. But then I heard a name. "You can't tell her," she said. My footsteps stopped on their own. "She won't understand. She'll hate me." My heart did something strange then, like it skipped and doubled back. I knew she was talking about me. I should have walked away. I know that now. But curiosity has a way of disguising itself as concern. And before I realized what I was doing, I was standing just close enough to hear the rest. There was another voice on the line, muffled but firm. A man's voice. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough to piece together something I wasn't supposed to know. Money, papers, our mother's name. And then Layla again, sharper this time, almost desperate. "It was supposed to be temporary," she said. "I didn't think it would get this far. I felt like the ground shifted under me. Nothing made sense, and yet everything did in the worst possible way." When she came out of her room minutes later and saw me standing there, we both froze. Her face changed instantly, like a curtain dropping. "You're home early," she said too quickly. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. We stood there in that narrow hallway, the air thick with everything unsaid. And in that moment something invisible cracked between us. I didn't confront her then. I told myself I needed more information, that jumping to conclusions would only make things worse. But the truth is I was afraid of what she might say, afraid of what it would mean for us. So instead I started watching, listening. Not in an obvious way, but enough to notice the little things that suddenly didn't feel so little anymore. The late-night calls, the way she flinched when I mentioned anything about our mother's estate, the stack of envelopes she kept tucked away in her drawer, always locking it when she left the room. Days turned into weeks, and the secret grew roots. It wrapped itself around every conversation, every shared meal, every quiet moment we used to cherish. Where there had once been ease, there was now tension. Where there had been trust, there was now doubt. And the worst part was, she could feel it too. I saw it in the way she looked at me sometimes, like she was bracing for something. "You're different," she said one night as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the TV playing something neither of us was actually watching. "You barely talk to me anymore." I wanted to say, "You stopped talking to me first." I wanted to ask her what she was hiding, to force everything into the open and deal with it head on. But instead I shrugged. "Just tired," I said. That lie tasted bitter the moment it left my mouth, because I wasn't just tired. I was torn, between the sister I had always trusted and the truth I was starting to uncover. between holding on to what we had and confronting something that might destroy it completely. And somewhere in that space, the secret kept growing, feeding on our silence, waiting for the moment it would finally come to light and turn us against each other in ways neither of us was ready for. The next few days didn't explode the way I half expected them to. No dramatic confrontation, no sudden confession spilling out in tears, just a slow tightening of something invisible that made even the simplest moments feel strained, like we were both walking across a surface we knew could crack at any second. And the strangest part was how normal everything looked from the outside, how we still moved through routines as if nothing had changed, sharing breakfast in silence, passing each other in the hallway with small, careful smiles that didn't quite reach our eyes. But underneath it all, something had shifted so deeply that I started to question every memory we had, every moment that once felt solid, wondering if I had missed signs, if this secret had been there all along, quietly growing while I remained blind to it. I found myself replaying that phone call over and over, dissecting each word, each pause, trying to piece together a truth that refused to fully reveal itself. And the more I thought about it, the more the fragments began to form a picture I didn't want to see, one that always led back to the same place: our mother, her estate, and something Layla had done without telling me, something that involved legal papers and money, and that tone in her voice I couldn't forget. The kind that doesn't come from small mistakes but from decisions that change things permanently. I started noticing how she guarded certain topics, how quickly she redirected conversations whenever I brought up anything remotely related to finances or the house, how her phone never left her side anymore even when she went to shower, how she'd glance at it every few minutes like she was waiting for something or someone, and every time it lit up, I felt a quiet jolt in my chest, a mix of curiosity and dread that I couldn't shake, because deep down I knew that whatever was happening, it was already bigger than I wanted it to be. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in that soft orange glow we used to love, I found myself standing outside her door again, not intentionally, just drawn there by the sound of her voice. Quieter this time, more controlled, but still carrying that same tension, and I told myself to walk away, to respect whatever boundary she had put up, but instead I stayed. Just long enough to hear a single sentence that changed everything. "It's already done, there's no going back now," and something inside me dropped heavy and final, because those weren't the words of someone considering a choice. Those were the words of someone who had already made one. I stepped back before she could open the door, my heart pounding harder than it should have, and went to the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady myself, because now it wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was certainty that something real had happened. Something irreversible, and I was the only one being kept in the dark. That night I barely slept, my mind running through possibilities, each one worse than the last, until I finally reached a point where I knew I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep living in this half-truth where everything felt off, but nothing was said out loud. And yet even then, when morning came and we sat across from each other at the table, I couldn't bring myself to ask the question that had been building inside me, because asking meant hearing the answer, and hearing the answer meant accepting whatever came with it. Instead, I watched her, really watched her, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee, the faint shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, the way she avoided looking directly at me for too long and for a brief moment. Something unexpected cut through my frustration, concern, because whatever she had done, it was clearly weighing on her too, and that complicated everything in a way I wasn't prepared for, because it would have been easier if she seemed unaffected, if she acted like none of this mattered, but she didn't, and that made me hesitate, made me wonder if there was more to the story than what I had overheard. Still, hesitation didn't erase the growing distance between us. And by the end of that week, it had become impossible to ignore our conversations, reduced to necessities, our shared spaces feeling unfamiliar, like we were guests in a house that used to belong to us but no longer did. And then came the moment that pushed everything closer to the edge. The moment I realized the secret wasn't just something hidden between us. It was something actively changing our lives without my knowledge. I had gone to check the mail that afternoon, a simple routine task. But as I flipped through the envelopes, one of them caught my attention, immediately official looking, addressed to both of us, with a return label from a legal office I didn't recognize, and my stomach tightened as I held it, turning it over in my hands, debating whether to open it or wait for Layla. But something told me that if I waited, I might never see what was inside, so I opened it right there on the front steps. the paper sliding out with a quiet sound that felt louder than it should have. And as my eyes scanned the first few lines, the world around me seemed to narrow, every word hitting harder than the last. Because it confirmed what I had feared in a way that left no room for doubt. Documents had been filed, decisions had been made, and somehow my name had been included in something I had never agreed to. I don't remember how long I sat there just staring at the page, trying to process what it meant, trying to understand how Layla could have gone this far without telling me, how something so significant could happen without a single conversation between us. And when I finally looked up, she was standing in the doorway watching me, her expression unreadable, and in that moment, the silence between us felt heavier than anything we could say, because now the secret wasn't hidden anymore. Not really, it was out in the open, sitting between us in the form of a piece of paper that changed everything. And the look in her eyes told me she knew that I knew. And whatever happened next, there was no going back to the way things were before. She didn't rush toward me or try to snatch the paper from my hands, which somehow made it worse, because it meant she had already accepted this moment, long before I ever reached it. And as I slowly stood up, the distance between us felt unfamiliar, like we were no longer standing on the same side of something, but facing each other from opposite ends of a line that had been drawn without my consent. "You opened it," she said, her voice quiet, not accusatory, just tired, and I almost laughed at the simplicity of that statement compared to everything it carried, because of course I opened it. How could I not? When my name was printed on something I had never seen, something that clearly mattered enough to be sent from a law office, something she had chosen not to tell me about. "When were you going to?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. But I didn't soften it, not this time, because I was done pretending that everything was fine, done carrying the weight of a secret that wasn't even mine to begin with. And for a moment she didn't answer, just looked at me with that same guarded expression I had been seeing for weeks, like she was measuring her words before letting them out. Like every sentence had consequences she was trying to calculate in real time. "I was going to tell you," she said finally, and the words landed flat between us, not because they were unbelievable, but because they were too late to matter, and we both knew it. I held up the paper slightly, my hand tightening around the edge. "This doesn't look like something you were planning to tell me. This looks like something you were hoping I'd never find out about." And that was the first time her expression cracked just slightly, but enough for me to see something underneath, guilt maybe, or fear, or both tangled together in a way that made it hard to separate them. "It's not like that," she said quickly, stepping closer now, but I instinctively stepped back, creating space I hadn't needed before. And that small movement seemed to hit her harder than anything I had said, because it made the distance between us real. "Then what is it like?" I pressed, my heart pounding in a way that made it hard to stay steady, because this was it. The moment everything I had been holding in was finally coming out, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next, but I knew I couldn't stop. Now she exhaled, slowly running a hand through her hair like she was trying to buy herself time. But there was no more time left to buy, not after this, not after the paper in my hand that spelled out decisions made behind my back, decisions tied to our mother's estate, to the house, to everything we had built together after she was gone. "I did it to protect us," she said. And that sentence, more than anything else, made something inside me snap, because it sounded so familiar, so rehearsed, like something she had been telling herself over and over until it felt true, even if it wasn't. "Protect us from what?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. And she hesitated again, which told me there was more, something deeper she hadn't said yet, something that explained why she had gone this far without me. "From losing everything," she said finally, and for a second, just a second, doubt crept in, because there was a sincerity in her voice that didn't match the betrayal I felt. And that contradiction threw me off balance in a way I hadn't expected. "We weren't losing everything," I said, but even as I said it, I realized I didn't actually know that for sure, because I hadn't been paying as close attention as I should have, trusting that she was handling things the way we always had together, openly, without secrets. "You don't know that," she replied. And there it was again, that tone. Not defensive, but firm, like she was holding on to something she believed I didn't understand. And maybe she was right. Maybe there were pieces I was missing, but that didn't change the fact that she had made decisions without me. Decisions that involved both of us. I shook my head slightly, trying to clear the swirl of thoughts that were starting to blur together. "Then explain it to me, Layla. All of it. No half-truths, no holding back. Because right now it feels like you cut me out of something that was supposed to be ours. and that word ours hung in the air between us, heavier than anything else. Because it wasn't just about the house or the money or the legal documents, it was about everything we had built together, everything we had promised each other after our mother died, that we wouldn't let anything come between us, that we would face everything side by side. And now here we were standing apart because of something she had chosen not to share. She looked at me for a long moment, really looked at me, like she was trying to decide whether to finally let me in or keep holding the line she had drawn, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same kind I had been feeling, but sharper, more immediate, because the truth was sitting right there waiting to be spoken, and once it was there would be no way to take it back. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steadier now, like she had made a decision. And something in my chest tightened in response, because I knew that whatever she was about to say was going to change things in a way we couldn't undo. She stepped closer again, slower this time, giving me the chance to move away if I wanted to. But I didn't. I stayed where I was, holding the paper like it was the only solid thing in that moment, and she took a breath before continuing. "A few months before Mom passed, she met with a lawyer," she began, and the mention of our mother immediately shifted something in me, pulling my attention fully into what she was saying, because this wasn't just about recent decisions anymore. This went further back than I realized. She changed some things. Layla continued, her eyes not leaving mine, and I felt a flicker of confusion because, as far as I knew, everything had already been settled. Everything had been clear. At least, that's what I had believed, what we had both believed, or at least what I thought we had believed together. "What things?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now, because suddenly this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about something deeper, something tied to our mother, in a way that made my chest feel tight. Layla swallowed before answering, and for the first time since this started, she looked genuinely uncertain, like she wasn't sure how I was going to react, like she was bracing for something she couldn't control. "The will," she said, and the word landed harder than anything else so far, because it meant everything that followed was going to matter more than I was ready for. And as I stood there waiting for her to continue, I realized that whatever this secret was, it didn't just start with her. It started with something our mother had done, something that had set all of this in motion long before either of us realized it. And now we were both standing in the middle of it, trying to figure out where we fit in a story that suddenly didn't feel like ours anymore. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't even fully process what she had just said, because the idea that our mother had changed the will without telling us felt like a quiet earthquake, something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along, shifting things in ways we were only now beginning to feel. And I searched Layla's face for some sign that I had misunderstood, that maybe this wasn't as serious as it sounded, but there was no softness there. No hesitation now that she had started, just a kind of steady resolve that made it clear this was real, all of it. "What do you mean she changed it?" I finally asked, my voice tight, because as much as I wanted clarity, I was already bracing for the impact of whatever came next. And Layla exhaled slowly, like she had been holding that breath for weeks, maybe months, waiting for this exact moment to finally release it. "I didn't know at first either," she said, and that caught me off guard, because for the first time since this started, she was placing herself on the same side of the confusion I felt, even if only briefly, and I held on to that just enough to keep listening instead of shutting down completely. "The lawyer contacted me about 2 months after the funeral," she continued, and I felt something twist inside me at that, because 2 months after the funeral was when everything had still been raw, when we were both barely holding ourselves together, leaning on each other just to get through the days. And the thought that she had been dealing with something like this during that time without telling me made the distance between us feel even wider. "Why didn't they contact both of us?" I asked the question, slipping out before I could stop it, because it didn't make sense. "None of it did," and she hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already feared, that there was a reason, and it wasn't one I was going to like. "Because of how it was written," she said carefully, and that carefulness set something off in me again. A warning signal that whatever she said next was going to hurt. Not just because of what it meant, but because of what it revealed about everything we thought we knew. "Just say it," I said more sharply than I intended, but I didn't take it back, because I needed the truth now, all of it, even if it broke something between us for good. She nodded slightly, like she understood that there was no soft way to deliver this, no version of the truth that wouldn't leave a mark. "Mom left the house in both our names," she said, and for a second relief, flickered through me because that part matched what I believed. What we had always believed, but it didn't last because I could already see in her expression that there was more, something that turned that shared ownership into something complicated. But I prompted the word barely out before she continued. But she added a clause, Layla said, and there it was, the shift, the detail that changed everything, the part she had been circling around since the beginning. What kind of clause? I asked, my stomach tightening as I waited for her answer, because at this point it felt like every new piece of information came with a cost. And I wasn't sure how much more we could absorb before something gave way completely. A conditional transfer. She said, her voice steady but softer now, like she knew exactly how this would sound to me. And maybe she did, because I felt my grip on the paper in my hand tighten again, the edges digging into my skin as I tried to stay grounded. If one of us couldn't maintain the property or keep up with the financial responsibilities, the other would have full control to make decisions regarding the house, she explained, and for a moment I just stared at her, trying to process what that meant, trying to fit it into everything that had happened over the past few weeks, and slowly, painfully, it started to make sense in a way I didn't want it to. You think I couldn't handle it? I said, the realization settling in with a weight that felt both personal and sharp, because this wasn't just about legal language anymore. It was about what she believed, what she had decided without me. No, she said quickly, shaking her head, but I cut her off before she could soften it, because I didn't want a softened version. I wanted the truth, even if it hurt more. Then why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking slightly despite my effort to keep it steady, because that was the part I couldn't reconcile, the part that made everything feel like a betrayal, no matter how she tried to explain it. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for a second I saw something raw in her expression, something that hadn't been there before, something closer to fear than guilt, because at first I didn't think it mattered. She said quietly, and I almost laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it at all, because how could something like this not matter? How could she have carried this knowledge and decided it wasn't important enough to share? It mattered the moment you knew, I said, and she flinched slightly at that, just enough to confirm that she knew it too, even if she hadn't acted like it. I know that now, she replied, and there was something in her voice that made me pause, not because it erased what had happened, but because it suggested there was more to the story, something that had shifted her from thinking it didn't matter to acting on it in a way that led us here. Then what changed? I asked, my tone softer now but no less urgent, because this was the part that connected everything, the part that explained why she had gone from keeping a secret to making decisions that affected both of us. She took a breath slower this time, like she was preparing herself for the part she had been avoiding the most, and I could feel the tension in the air tighten again, like we were approaching the center of something neither of us could step away from now. The bills, she said, and at first it sounded almost too simple, too ordinary to explain something this big, but the way she said it, the weight behind those two words told me it was anything but simple. What about them? I asked, and she looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again, her expression steady but heavy. They weren't getting paid, she said, and that landed differently than everything else, not sharp like a betrayal, but heavy like a truth I hadn't seen coming, and I felt something shift inside me. Not enough to erase the anger or the hurt, but enough to complicate it, because if what she was saying was true, then this wasn't just about a decision she made in secret. It was about something that had been happening right in front of me, without me realizing it. Something that had forced her into a position she didn't know how to handle any other way. And as I stood there holding the paper that had started this entire confrontation, I realized that the secret between us wasn't just one thing. It was a chain of choices and consequences, each one building on the last, pulling us further apart while convincing her she was holding everything together. And now we were both standing in the aftermath, trying to understand how something that started with protection had turned into the very thing that was breaking us apart. It was hard to believe how fast the walls seemed to close in, once the truth started settling like air thick with tension, where every familiar face, every corner of the house we had grown up in, suddenly carried weight we hadn't recognized before, and I could feel it pressing down on me as Layla continued. I tried to handle it quietly, to avoid the fight, to let things slide until Mum came back, until someone could see the reality without escalating everything. And I nodded, though inside a storm of disbelief was raging, because the quiet handling of a financial collapse seemed at once practical and infuriating, a betrayal wrapped in concern. and I wanted to shake her to demand that she had no right to decide. Yet I also sensed that her hands had been tied in ways I couldn't immediately grasp. And that realization made my anger sharper and more confused. "You mean you just let it spiral?" I asked the words harsher than I intended, because it felt like every day that passed without confrontation had been another brick in the wall between us. Yet she shook her head, her eyes pleading with me to see a nuance I hadn't yet accepted. "I didn't let it spiral. I tried to contain it, to buy us time. But the bills, the unpaid taxes, the repairs, they kept stacking. And each time I tried to intervene, it seemed there was another obstacle, another reason it couldn't be resolved immediately, and I—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I thought keeping it quiet would protect you from the stress, from the worry, from the fights we couldn't afford," and hearing that I felt a mix of incredulity and reluctant understanding, because while her silence had felt like betrayal, it was rooted in a desire to shield me from harm. And that made the knife of her secrecy twist, differently cutting at a place I hadn't known existed in me, a fracture between intention and impact, between care and control. And I realized that her love had been a complicated, heavy thing weighted by her own fear of losing what little control she had left over the house and our family. And yet in trying to protect me, she had inadvertently positioned herself as the arbiter of our reality, deciding who would know what would happen and how, and that was a power I had never consented to relinquish. I could feel my chest tighten, my mind racing through all the instances where she had intervened without my knowledge. From minor repairs to the decisions about insurance payments, and the realization made me understand that while the house had been a home, it had also been a chessboard where every piece moved without my awareness. And the consequences have been as real as any confrontation, leaving me questioning the entire history of my trust in her judgment, while simultaneously seeing how much of it had been dictated by the sheer inertia of circumstance rather than malice. "So when you say conditional transfer," I asked, my voice low and deliberate, "you're talking about her positioning one of us as responsible, as the fallback, as the one who would carry the weight if the other failed?" She nodded, her fingers brushing nervously against the edge of the dining table, a gesture I had always known as nervousness in moments of truth. "Exactly. And it wasn't meant to punish you. At least I don't think it was meant that way. It was meant to safeguard the property, to keep it from being lost entirely, but it also created this invisible hierarchy between us. And I think she knew we'd feel it. We'd compete, we'd question loyalty and responsibility, and in doing so, she made sure the house would survive, even if our relationship didn't." And I sat back, absorbing the words as though they were stones dropping into a still pond, each rippling outward-reaching corners of my memory, where half-forgotten resentments and misunderstandings had been quietly fermenting. And suddenly the argument over the broken window, the neglected garden, the overdue mortgage notices, all of it coalesced into a new terrifying clarity, a narrative in which our mother had always been several steps ahead, orchestrating a survival strategy that involved deception as a shield, manipulation as protection, and secrecy as a necessity. And I felt a surge of both admiration and betrayal that tangled together like the roots of the oak tree in the front yard that had witnessed every fight, every whispered conversation, every moment of silence between us, holding witness to our misunderstandings and unspoken frustrations. "And you?" I asked finally, needing to understand where she had placed herself in this. "How did you reconcile your role, knowing everything and acting in silence?" Layla looked down at her hands, intertwining fingers as though holding them together might contain the magnitude of her choices. "I reconciled by remembering what we didn't see," she said softly, "the stress Mom carried, the debt she didn't want to broadcast, the fear of losing everything before we had a chance to understand it. I acted as I thought she would have wanted, though I now see that in doing so I became part of the chain, part of the secrecy that pulled us apart instead of keeping us safe." And the weight of her words hit me with the force of a storm, because here she was admitting culpability, not in the criminal sense, but in the emotional, relational sense. And it forced me to confront my own assumptions, my own interpretations of events that had seemed self-evident, but now revealed layers I hadn't considered, layers of intention, protection, fear, and ultimately, love that had been twisted into something unrecognizable by circumstance. I ran my hands through my hair and leaned back against the chair, feeling the afternoon sun spill into the room, warm and unrelenting, highlighting dust motes that danced lazily in the air. And I realized that this confrontation was not simply about property or inheritance or even the bills. It was about our capacity to understand, forgive, and navigate the complex realities of human behavior when everything is shaded with fear, protection, and unspoken reasoning, and the magnitude of the task we faced to rebuild trust felt nearly impossible. Because we were no longer just two siblings caught in a disagreement, we were heirs to an invisible legacy of secrecy, charged with untangling a web our mother had spun with careful deliberation and with a sense of urgency that we hadn't appreciated until now, and I felt both the pressure and the possibility, the crushing weight of responsibility and the strange exhilaration that came from finally seeing the whole landscape of our family's hidden terrain, which had been obscured by emotion, time, and the assumed certainty of our mother's decisions. And I realized that the path forward required not only confrontation with one another, but confrontation with the invisible hand that had guided our lives in ways we had never fully acknowledged, that required patience, courage, and a willingness to step into the shadows of our own hearts to recognize that the very thing that had turned us against each other might also be the key to reconnecting, to understanding, and perhaps to forgiveness. And as Layla's eyes met mine steady and earnest, I could see the reflection of my own confusion, my own desire to make sense of a senseless seeming situation, and I knew that the next steps, however fraught, would demand a collaboration born not from trust, not yet, but from the undeniable recognition that the secret we had unearthed had the power to destroy or to teach, and that our response now would define the nature of the bond that remained, fragile though it might be. And in that heavy silence I felt the first faint flicker of resolve, a tiny flame of possibility that we could navigate the aftermath, that we could reclaim agency over the parts of our lives that had been obscured by secrecy, and perhaps, just perhaps, turn the weight of the past into a bridge that might carry us to something resembling understanding, something like peace, though the path there was uncertain, jagged, and undeniably ours to walk together. No matter how reluctant or wary we felt, no matter how much pain still lingered in the spaces between words, between intentions, between the history we had inherited, and in that moment the gravity of what had been revealed, coupled with the faint spark of possibility, made me realize that our story, complicated and broken as it was far from over, that the next chapter would demand courage we hadn't yet fully summoned, patience we hadn't yet tested, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths of love, legacy, and human imperfection, because the secret that had turned us against each other was only a starting point, not an ending. And the work of reclaiming our relationship and our understanding of our family would be the story we wrote from this moment onward. Every choice, a word, every conversation, a sentence, every act of courage or concession, a paragraph in the unfolding narrative of who we were, who we had been, and who we might still become together, despite the wounds, despite the betrayals, despite the weight of the past that pressed upon us, because even in the darkest shadows of secrecy, there is always a path forward if we are willing to see it. And I could feel, for the first time in weeks, the faint pulse of that path beneath my feet, waiting for us to take the first step. The next morning I woke to the sound of the sun striking the windows just right, catching the dust motes and making them glow like tiny sparks in the air, and for a moment I let myself breathe, feeling the weight of yesterday's revelations pressing against my chest, but also realizing that the day ahead offered the first true chance to act rather than react, to reclaim a measure of control in a situation that had long felt dictated by secrets and half-truths. And I knew I had to start with clarity, with a plan that balanced confrontation with strategy, because the wrong word, the wrong gesture could send everything spiraling back into the chaos we had just begun to untangle. And I found Layla in the kitchen, her eyes tired but alert, standing by the counter with a notebook open, scribbles covering the pages, diagrams of bank statements, lists of calls made, names of people who had witnessed events, and I realized that she had already started organizing the information we needed, parsing it carefully, like an archaeologist sifting through layers of sediment, every detail crucial, every omission dangerous. And I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with apprehension, because even though I had once resented her silence, I now understood the courage it had taken to maintain it, the discipline to keep track of every fact, every nuance, even as it strained our relationship and created the very tension that now hung between us like a tangible presence. And I approached her quietly, watching her pause mid-note, glance up, and then nod with a faint smile that carried a hint of apology, a recognition that we were in this together, yet the unspoken history between us still hovered unresolved, a shadow in the room that neither of us could ignore. and I sat down across from her, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the gravity of the moment to settle, because I knew that rushing into discussion without acknowledgement of the past would only weaken our strategy. And then I spoke, my voice measured but firm. We need to document everything, every transaction, every conversation, every promise made and broken, because if this goes to court, if Mum's intentions are questioned, if anyone challenges our right to act, we need an unassailable record. And she nodded, flipping through her notebook with careful fingers, marking sections with colored tabs underlining critical points, and I realized that her methodical approach was exactly what I had needed, someone who could navigate the details while I focused on the bigger picture, the overarching strategy, the narrative that would allow us to confront the situation with clarity and confidence. And as we worked, the tension between us softened slightly, replaced by a shared purpose, a recognition that despite our fractured relationship, we were capable of forming an alliance strong enough to withstand the storms ahead, because the stakes were higher than sibling rivalry. This was about legacy, about justice, about reclaiming the truth that had been obscured by secrecy and fear. And as we planned the first steps, phone calls to accountants, meetings with legal counsel, letters drafted to clarify intent, access to accounts, documentation of property deeds, it became clear that each action needed to be deliberate, precise, unassailable, because any misstep could give the opposition leverage, could allow the past mismanagement and secrecy to be used against us. And I felt the familiar pulse of tension mixed with purpose, the adrenaline that comes when the magnitude of responsibility is coupled with the possibility of control. And I could sense Layla feeling it too, because her hands moved with a deliberate steadiness over the pages, her eyes sharp, her brow furrowed, and every so often we exchanged glances that said more than words ever could, a silent acknowledgement that the past could not be changed, but the present could be managed, shaped, and directed toward resolution. And I realized that for the first time in months, perhaps years, we were moving from reaction to action, from confusion to control, from estrangement to collaboration. And that awareness, though heavy with the weight of responsibility, carried with it a strange relief, the sort of relief that comes from finally knowing where to start, even if the path ahead is uncertain, because starting is always the first victory, the first reclaiming of agency in a situation that once felt impossible. And as the morning light shifted across the kitchen, highlighting the notes, the diagrams, the meticulous record-keeping, I felt a flicker of hope. A sense that through careful planning, deliberate steps, and shared determination, we could not only untangle the web of secrets that had divided us, but also reclaim our voices, our rights, and our ability to act with authority and integrity. And I could see it reflected in Layla's eyes, that same mix of determination and cautious optimism. And I knew that despite everything, we had a chance, a real tangible chance to reclaim what had been obscured, lost, or taken. To assert the truth, to navigate the complex landscape our mother's decisions had left behind. And as we move forward through the meticulous organization of information, the careful preparation of legal steps, the mapping of potential obstacles and allies, the call lists, the appointments, the drafts of letters, the spreadsheet of accounts, and the diagrams of property deeds, I felt a sense of empowerment slowly replacing the lingering sting of betrayal, because the work itself, deliberate, careful, and thorough, became an act of reclamation, a reclaiming of control, a declaration that we would no longer be passive participants in a narrative written by secrecy and assumption, but active architects of the resolution. And in that moment, I understood that the real secret to overcoming the fractures and betrayals was not confrontation alone, nor vengeance, nor even exposure, but clarity, preparation, and the shared commitment to act with knowledge, precision, and a sense of moral and strategic responsibility. And as the hours stretched on, as we catalogued, organized, and prepared, the tension between us continued to ease, replaced by a quiet focus, a shared sense that while the road ahead would not be simple or easy, it was navigable, and that together we could face the consequences, anticipate the challenges, and act decisively. Because the secret that had turned us against each other had also paradoxically created a space for collaboration, for insight, and for the first real steps toward resolution. And by the time the afternoon sun hung high in the sky, we had created not just a plan, but a shared framework of understanding, a roadmap that allowed us to see where the dangers lay, where we could intervene, and where we needed to hold our ground. And I felt an unexpected calm, a sense that in organizing the chaos and translating secrecy and misunderstanding into clarity and strategy, we were reclaiming not just the tangible elements of our mother's estate and intentions, but also our own agency, our capacity to act and our ability to trust each other enough to move forward together. And in that quiet, focused energy, I realized that the journey ahead, though long and fraught with potential conflict, was no longer a threat to tear us apart, but a challenge we could meet with intelligence, careful planning, and the slowly growing bond of siblings who had faced the shadow of secrecy and chosen finally to turn it into something constructive, something actionable, something that might, in time, repair the fractures and create a foundation on which we could stand together stronger, more aware, and ready to confront whatever remnants of the past remained to be addressed, because the work we were doing now, meticulous, patient, strategic, was the key to turning the betrayal, the fear, the secrecy, and the misunderstandings into a pathway forward, a way to reclaim not just the material elements of our inheritance, but the trust, the agency, and the clarity that had been buried under years of silence and miscommunication. And as the last note was written in the notebook, as the final call was scheduled, as the last diagram was reviewed, I felt a cautious but real sense of progress, a recognition that we had begun to transform the secret that had divided us into a roadmap for resolution. And that for the first time in a long time, the storm that had loomed over our family was not something we feared, but something we were actively navigating together, with eyes wide open and hearts prepared for the work ahead, knowing that the real power lay not in exposing the secret alone, but in how we chose to act in its aftermath. And in that understanding, I found a renewed sense of purpose, a sense that despite the pain, despite the betrayal, despite the years of misunderstanding, we could reclaim our narrative, our rights, and our bonds step by careful step, and that realization, fragile and hard-won, was more valuable than any immediate victory could ever be.